Funding for this program is brought to you in part by Crowning Touch Senior Moving Services.
Welcome everyone, I'm Rose Martin and this is Real Life with Susan Harf, our very favorite life coach who's giving us tips and strategies and some suggestions for how we can navigate those tricky things, those situations we find ourselves in. Like you, I cannot wait to hear what's on our mind today. Hi Susan.
Hi Rose, I'm happy to see you and I'm very happy that you joined us as well. So today we are talking about our friends and why we need them. You know that song, You Got to Have Friends?
Yeah.
You do. You got to have friends. And friends really play a very important role in our lives.
You know, I'm so interested in this topic because right up front, I'm not a great friend.
Oh, yes, you are.
I
beg to differ.
I don't think so. Like we grew up, I remember my mom, I'm one of five, I'm oldest of five. My parents always said, you know, your friends will come and go. I want you to be best friends with your brother and your sisters. And so we talk a lot about family of origin. So we were kind of raised as your siblings, you know, those are going to be your best friends, right? So typically, like when I think back, like Bob's got friends from high school and college and things, and I don't maintain those long-term relationships as friends.
And you think it's because that was your training in the family you grew up in?
I'm wondering now because I count on my sisters are my best friends. You know, so I think, ooh, I can't wait to hear what you have to say today on all this.
Well, first of all, I applaud you for that because people who tell me that their best friends are their siblings mean that their parents really did something right, because it's what's difficult about those relationships and maintaining a friendship with a sibling for some people is the fact that you have all that history, and sometimes the history is not always wonderful and sometimes can be dysfunctional. And so to maintain healthy ongoing relationships with your siblings, I think, is really important and a wonderful thing to be able to do, and not everyone can or does. But what we're talking about today is the roles that other people play in our lives as friends. And the reason why some people have friends, friendships that last so long, I think is because we don't judge our friends the same way that we do our family members. So for instance, if your friend tells you that their spouse did something that they didn't like, your reaction is apt to be, well, now why did they do that? That wasn't very nice, or they need to step up to the plate. Our first reaction is loyalty to a friend. So that may not be the same reaction if it was your spouse who did the very same thing that the friend did. So let's just think for an example. Let's say your friend is late and versus your husband is late. So
okay, you know how I feel about being late. So.
Yes, I do. That's why I'm using that.
Right.
That's why I'm using that example. So let's say you really don't like when someone's late. And let's say your husband is late for an important engagement with you. Let's say you're going to the theater and he's supposed to meet you there and the play is starting and he's not there. And he's usually running 10 to 15 minutes late, let's just say. And my guess is that your husband is not, because he knows how you feel about it.
Right.
But let's say he always is running late. And he gets to the play and you sit down and you're in a huff. And you may say then, or at intermission, you may say, I told you what time it started and you came late and I didn't know if you were laying in a ditch or what the problem was. You can start a whole thing. If your friend is late, you may say, oh, I was worried about you. Did you get stuck in traffic?
I'm laughing because that is absolutely true, because you're compassionate more so with a friend than you are with someone who should know better.
That's right. So you say to them in such a nicer way, I was worried about you. Your feelings about yourself are not at stake there. You don't have a stake in their misconduct. The reason why you're treating the spouse a certain way, unlike how you would treat a friend in that situation, is because you got a stake in it. And what I mean by that is things take over that are sometimes not as rational as what you would say to the friend, which is, you know, I was hoping that you were okay, or I hope that you weren't in a traffic jam, or I hope there wasn't a train, or, you know, whatever that stopped you from progressing along your route. You're concerned about them in that moment. But when you're dealing with somebody who's a family member, not a friend, but a family member of yours, like especially your spouse, you may say, why did you come later? Couldn't you have left the office earlier? You're going to be more harsh sometimes. And that is because the unspoken sort of stake that you have in the conversation relates to, aren't you concerned about being on time for me? Don't you value what I value? Don't you value the fact that I want you to be on time? Is that something you're saying about me? You're disrespecting me? You know, all of these things, some are rational, some are irrational. Thoughts come into play when the person disappoints you. Whereas with a friend, you're not as likely to be disappointed. That feeling of disappointment, which sometimes leads to anger, is not going to enter into the interaction with the friend because you don't have a concern that they're trying to express their latent disrespect for you at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about new friendships, you know, brand new friendships that you're just making, friends that have been, you know, decades, lifelong friends that people have. And, you know, the importance of that, even as girlfriends that you might have to talk about other things with, or, you know, even if they're male friends or opposite sex friends that, that you have. How important are those in a relationship to be outside of your nucleus family, that you have those?
I think they're very important. And I think that if you're not someone, if you're somebody who is not used to having a lot of friends, one of the things I want to say about friends too is that you don't have to have a lot. You know, it doesn't, some people they find that they just, you know, my friends tell me that I pick up people, that I pick up people all the time. And I do, because that's just part of my personality. I do gravitate to people, and I usually, because of my work also, there isn't anyone that I've met that I can have something in common with, and regardless of where we come from or what we do in life, I tend to find something to gravitate to with most people that I meet. So I tend to be involved with a lot of people. Not everyone has to be. Not everyone wants a lot of people in their life. So even if you have one good friend or a couple of good friends, it's very important to have somebody in your life other than your family that validate you, that validate your choices, that validate your thoughts and feelings. And oftentimes our friends are people that are sounding boards for us, who, because they don't have a primal stake in what we do, they can be more objective about the response that they give. Having said that, so to answer your question, yes, it's very important. Having said that, friendships take all different kinds of forms. Some people find it difficult to trust. And so they need a long time, a long friendship to develop over time before they can trust someone. And then when they trust you, it's because they've known you a long time. That's a barometer for some people with which to determine how they're going to move into a more trusting relationship with you. It's got to be time that suggests that's the barometer for them. For other people, it isn't. I have found that as I get older, I don't need as much time to trust someone, because I think, in my mind, my instincts are much sharper relative to what makes me trust someone.
I agree with you, because it's a gut level thing. If I connect with someone, I do. And if I don't connect with someone, then, you know, when I was younger, it may have been much more laborious to try to work it through, and they'll try to be your friend. And by this age, you're like, you know what, it's okay.
That's exactly right. So what determines a friendship is usually vulnerability. When you are close with someone, it's because you know them and they know you, and you have divulged things about yourself to them. That is part of what creates a friendship, is being able to be open and honest with people about yourself. There are other friendships, though, that people have that don't necessarily involve vulnerability, deep closeness. It can be the people that have their locker next to you at your locker in the gym. It can be people that you see in a class you go to once a week. It can be
Your neighbors.
Your neighbors. It can be people that you're friendly with,
Yeah.
and you may even go to lunch once in a while with, but they're not necessarily your close friends because you're choosing not to divulge deep, dark things about or even bright things about yourself.
You know, that makes sense because when you're vulnerable and you're willing to share a part of you, and then they do that same thing, it's a reciprocal kind of openness that you're realizing it's not one-sided. But I've got a question for you. What about people, parents, who are their best friends with their children? So they might be little children, they might be their teenagers, they might be just children are their best friends.
I think it depends on how old the child is, and routinely I say that when you are parenting young children into middle school years and into teenagerhood, I do not believe that they should be your best friends. You have a role as a parent and a guardian and as a supervisor and as a role model for them in ways that you don't with friends. And I don't believe that the child then should be put in a position of having to be your friend. So it's like a reciprocal thing. It's not only do I think should you expect to be their friend and be chums with them, but I also don't think that, for instance, you're not, as adults, you may go out for drinks with your friends. Well, that should not be happening with your teenager. And at the same time, it's too much of a burden to expect your teenager to be your friend, because friends tell each other things. Friends confide in each other. There are things that are going on in your life that should not be privy to your children. They should not be laid upon your children. Let's say you're going through a horrible divorce. Let's say you're going through something that's very painful. This is between you and your spouse. Of course, your kids are involved because they're there. But I don't believe that you should sit down with your child and say, let me tell you all the reasons that I don't like your father anymore or your mother, and this is why I'm getting a divorce. That's not appropriate. So, and yet you do need somebody to listen to you, and a friend is that person, sometimes a therapist or a coach, but friends provide the kind of unconditional regard and love for you that not in the same way. I mean, you want your children to unconditionally love you, but not because you are relying on them to be a peer. They are not your peers. When I see people doing that with their teenagers, for instance, when I was raising my kids, I actually knew parents who would be drinking with their kids, or allow them to use what they considered to be non-harmful drugs. That was completely against my value system. I don't believe in any way, shape, or form you should be doing that with your kids. So no, I don't believe you should be best friends with your kids. Now, having said that, my children are now in their 30s. I have a lot of clients who have adult children, and I love the fact that I speak to them as adults. I rely on them for their opinions. Both of my kids have expertise in certain areas, and I rely on them for those things. I like asking them questions, and I like getting their responses, and I value their opinion. Yeah. Having said that, I try not to burden them at the same time as I would. I'm not burdening a peer either, but I consider it a burden when you treat your child, no matter how old they are, as a peer. They're not my peer. And still, as you know, and we've talked about on this program, I give advice to my kids. I give advice to my friends too if they ask. Not in the same way, and that leads me to another point about friendships. Some of your friends really want gut level honesty from you. And when they do, they will tell you. And if they don't tell you, don't assume they want that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because I have seen friendships gone awry because one person was brutally honest with the other and they didn't want it. Sometimes clients will say to me, if you know your friend's partner, your friend's husband or wife is doing something that they would not approve of, should you tell them? Let's say you know. So I have clients who, I have two couples who are friends with each other who are both clients of mine. And one of the couples said to me, I know that in the other couple that he is having an emotional affair with someone. Should we tell her? And that's very, very tricky because I said, why do you want to tell her? And they said, because if it was happening to us, we'd want to know. So in that case, what I would advise people to do is to ask their friend, if I know something that might be painful for you, would you want me to tell you?
But don't you already know if you lead with that kind of a question?
Yes.
Then you're kind of like telling
Yes.
someone, I already know something, but do you really want to know it?
So ask that question when it's not happening.
Okay.
So sometimes people need to check out with each other, what are the rules of this friendship? So you may say, I have a friend, you know, you can use it in the sort of vernacular of, I had a friend who didn't want to know if her child was smoking at school on the corner. The child, you know, was smoking a cigarette before school when they got there early and smoking on the corner with the kids. So I had a friend who wanted to know, would you want to know if that was your child? You know, there's ways of feeling people out. Some people will surprise you with what they don't want to know, especially if you're someone who does want to know everything.
Yeah.
So you need to ask those questions of your friends and not make assumptions about what they want to know or how superficial or not superficial you want them to be. Now, having said that, when you meet someone who requires or wants a certain kind of intimacy from you that you're not willing to give, those relationships usually go awry because there's not the same mutuality there. So here's something for me that's important as a friend. I really believe that mutuality in general in relationships is important. And what I mean by mutuality is the level of intimacy, is how connected are we really going to be? So in other words, if I believe that I want to be able to tell you things and trust that I have your confidence, that you will never repeat anything that I say to you about my life, then that to me is something that I value in a relationship. If they, however, don't value that, and they're someone who's going to be a chatty, they say chatty Cathy, if they're going to be talking about you, that right there is a no for me. That's something that's not mutual. So if that mutuality doesn't exist, I'm not likely to continue that relationship in the same way.
But if that mutuality, would you also expect that that person would take you into their confidence to share those things that they were that they wanted to share with you, knowing that you would not share them? Was that part of mutuality too, for what you expect, what you give, and what you expect?
I think that the degree to which you are vulnerable with your friend is the same degree that will determine how close you are. So yes, I would prefer that. I would prefer that people trust me the way I'm going to trust them, of course. And then as they do that, the relationship is going to get stronger.
What about people who say, I just can't make friends? I don't know, even if I don't have any friends, I'm at home. It doesn't matter what age they are. Just said, you know, I'm just really awkward at trying to make a friend.
If they say I'm awkward at trying to make a friend and I want to have a friend, then I would advise them to do certain things. If they say I can't make friends and I have my sisters and I'm perfectly content, then that's fine.
Well, I have friends, but
Yes.
my sisters are my best friends.
Yes. So in that case, then you're fine. You're good. You don't need to use any more skills than so. But if someone says I'm awkward and I don't feel comfortable having friends, or I don't know how to make a friend. Not that I don't feel comfortable having friends. If I don't know how to make a friend, then I say you need to take a leap of faith and you need to find something that you believe you have in common. In other words, you're not going to walk up to a stranger on the street and say, hi, would you be my friend? But find someone that you already know that you have something in common with and make an overture. Sometimes you need to be the person to make the overture, even when you have long-term friends. I have a client right now who is going through the death of her spouse, and she's young. She's in her early 60s. And Notice what gets young as I
Yeah,
get older.
I know.
the
I'm
ages
right
get-
there with
get
you.
young.
I'm taking it
The
away.
ages get younger. So she's in her early 60s, and she's going through the death of her spouse. And her friends are not inviting her over as much. And I said, okay, it's not that they don't want to be with you, but they don't know what to do. And so you need to make the overture. You need to say, I'm going to have a few people for dinner. I want you to come over and have dinner with me. And she said, I wish I didn't have to do that. It's awkward. I'm not a couple anymore. I said, I know, but you got to do it.
Right, and that's so important when you're navigating something new in life, a life change.
Exactly.
To where you're going to have to figure out how to get started again and how to reach out.
Exactly. So, for instance, we moved to Roanoke. We didn't know people. We were at a pool club, and there was a woman who swam at the same time that I did. And one day, at the end of our swim, we were both sort of getting out of the pool, and I approached her, and I said, Linda, would you ever like to, and I knew that her husband was there also, and so I hadn't met him, and I said, would you and your husband like to have dinner with my husband? My husband swam also. Would you, and she knew him from the pool. I said, would you like to have dinner with us sometime? She said, yes, I would. And she introduced us to her husband, and before you know it, we went on a hike with them. Hiking and kayaking were two things that were not in my vocabulary before I came to Roanoke, but we went hiking with
Right.
Linda and her husband, and we loved it.
That's
we loved it.
fabulous.
So Linda is my friend. I had to make the overture to Linda to say, I knew
Right.
that there were things that we both enjoy. We both love to swim. We both like to be outdoors. So I said to her, would you like to get together? So the mutuality is important in friendships. The extent to which you're willing to be vulnerable is important with friendships. And I'm not saying that we have to have every relationship be a deep, long-lasting, forever relationship. Sometimes you meet people at certain stages of your life, and you connect around that stage. So for instance, when my kids were going through school, I tended to relate to the parents of my children's friends. And so we would be together for activities that our children, ball games and things that their kids were doing. We didn't necessarily see each other through the rest of the decades, of our lives, but we were friends. And we moved away, or we our kids were not involved in the sport anymore, or whatever. We moved on, but the relationships never became close, long-term, enduring friends. But we certainly had a lovely friendship. And I wouldn't say it's over. If one of them called me now, I would receive them well. I'd be happy to hear from them and talk to them. But it doesn't mean that, when you're in association with people, it doesn't mean it has to be forever and it has to extend to every arena of your life. So for instance, you may have girlfriends where you've never met their husband, or you may not have gotten together as couples, but you and she are friends. So that's the thing that's okay. Sometimes you have, as we said at the very beginning, you have friends that you're with in a certain situation in your life, and you see them at that class, and you see them at that function, but you don't necessarily extend that relationship to the rest of your family and life.
What about people who are grieving the loss of a friendship? Maybe it was a 30-year-old friendship, and people just either moved away or they found different interests, and they're just not friends anymore.
A relationship,
We're not as close anymore, I should
and I'm
say.
so glad you brought that up, because a relationship that ends, that has been a very close relationship, and I almost don't know anyone that hasn't had that situation happen. There's definitely a grieving process. It's like a divorce. In some ways, it really is, especially if you've had that unconditional love and that closeness, and especially if it's been a long time. There's a book about this topic called Dumped, and it's a book about women's relationships and that ended. And the book, I love the book because it's a series of essays written by different people. I happen to know the author, and she wrote about her own story and then elicited the stories of others. It's a good book to get if around this issue. It really is something then that needs to be mourned, because you miss that person. Even though it ended, and it ended for a reason, and by the way, it's never one reason. Sometimes people think, well, we had an argument. But in fact, if you really look back, you were sort of moving to a place where you weren't being as close. Sometimes people pick a fight because they want out of the relationship. Sometimes, you know, one of the things that is awkward in our lives is the fact that in many cases, it takes time to get to really know someone. And I find this with my clients who are dating and then the relationship ends, and that wasn't necessarily just a friendship, but it was a dating relationship. And I say to them, the reason you're mourning this is because you really put time and effort into this. And so, unfortunately, that's the way we get close to people. So sometimes the closer we get, there are times when we find out this isn't someone I want to know forever.
Susan,
and it's sad.
That is sad. So what do you think, if we're talking about friendships and why they're important, what are one or two things that are takeaways that someone says, you know, okay, that's why they're important?
We all need people in our lives who not only love us, but will unconditionally validate our choices and validate who we are and give us a break. Our friends are the people who say to us, you know what, that's okay. So what? So what if it happened that way? Tomorrow it'll be fine. Or the person, I'll tell you what my friend said to me last night. We have just moved. We've got tons of boxes we're unpacking and putting out in the hall to be taken down and thrown out. And last night at about 1 in the morning, we took the boxes out and we were stuffing the wrapping paper, the packing paper in, making lots of noise. And we came in, and my friend called at 1 in the morning because she's up late and she knows I am. And I said, oh, you'll never guess what we just did. We went out in the hall, we're packing the paper in the boxes, and I'm sure our new neighbors are going to think we're crazy. And she said, no, they're not. Once they meet you, even if you kept them up. And I said, I'm scared that we kept them up. And she said, even if you did, they're going to know that you didn't do it on purpose. They're going to still like you. They're going to want you as neighbors. That was her response.
Susan, we're going to have to end this right here because we've already gone over and they're probably going to think I'm crazy. As always, thanks, Susan, so much for the advice and the tips for how to be a really good friend. Make sure to join us next